Alrighty, so it is morning again, and we are looking at the backlog again. And yeah, we have not a lot of people right now here, but we have enough people here to make some progress. And we started with some things that will get Tanner very excited. Maybe.
It's worth noting I did talk to Jeff. These will not go into 5.0, even if we push them forward to review today. So still no problem reviewing them up front, but they're not going to be in 5.0.
Even if it's community PR?
Right. There's just we basically locked down on that, and these given that there's trivial workarounds for them, and this is more just completing the API surface. They wouldn't be qualifiers for 5.0. They wouldn't meet the bar.
Fair enough.
Did we already fork the branches? We did, right? So now master is 6.
No.
No, master's RC1 still.
Okay. When are we going to do this?
I don't know.
RC1. So
I mean,
about 3 more weeks.
Yeah, I was about to say, okay, 3 more weeks. That seems fine.
Well, in like 3, if I understand, in 3 weeks we'll do the split, or in 3 weeks we'll move master or merge master into the release branch, and then master won't go into the release branch again. So the last auto merge is in 3 weeks.
Got it.
Plus or minus.
So I assume the API proposal is making them public, right?
Yeah, the proposal here is making these existing ones public.
Yep.
They just provide parity with the existing single to int 32 bits and double to int 32 bits, and then the reverse, int 32 bits to single and int 64 bits to double.
Gotcha.
Just looking at the current names.
Yeah, I do the same right now.
Yeah.
Why would we make it half 2? Why not just 2?
Because the existing one's called double 2.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Oh, the bits ones are always from
Yeah.
2. I see.
Why would we add half if we don't have float? Oh, we do.
We do. It's single.
It's under S instead of F, and the alphabet's hard. Okay.
And half we called half, right? Not anything else.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems like the names are in alignment with what we have then. It's a bit weird that they're all over the place, but hey.
Well, if we could go back 20 years, we could suggest the names float 16, float 32, and float 64.
No, I meant more like the naming convention, because almost everything is 2xxx, and then for these guys, it just is unfortunate that they're like alphabetically sorted always all over the place, but it is what it is. I guess they didn't take the API reviews too seriously when they did it in 2.0. Oh, 1.0 actually, yeah, never mind. Yeah, it is what it is.
Yep. So those names seem reasonable.
I'm surprised your APIs of .NET tool goes back to .NET Framework 1.0, because I don't even know, like, I have full access to CorpNet. I don't even know where to find that installer.
Actually, there was I was working hard on that one. I think somebody actually pointed me to a public download, and I went through significant trouble, because it was before we had a thing called reference assemblies. I had to actually physically extract the thing, and then it was quite a journey. But like, I was like, I really want to see the 1.0 there.
Yeah, I feel like I even went looking harder at one point and found like the 1.0 beta build that had Brian's printer on fire exception.
Did you guys know that at some point we had daytime.parse, and you could throw in the string Brett's wedding, and it would actually return the wedding date for Brett Abrams?
Nice.
Yeah, you can do things like that. Consider adding half support to the binary primitives class. I guess it's the same story here.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is basically just providing parity with what we've got for single and double, but for half. And Eric currently has internal equivalents for CBOR. It would basically just be making those public.
Gotcha.
I also left a comment near the bottom of this issue saying we should add these two binary reader and binary writer as well.
Yeah, I was about to ask that. Like, are there any, like, should we batch them up maybe? But I guess that's hard, right? Because it's all over the place. But yeah, it seems like when it comes to primitives, there's probably a few areas that we need to look at.
Yeah, I mean, binary primitives, the things on it don't follow our span guidance, but making the new things look like the other things on that same type is probably better. Like, it doesn't, the read half little Indian doesn't tell you how much it wrote. It's up to you to know that half is
2 bytes.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously it's half.
And that's why it needs to return the number.
I mean, for primitives, it's not terrible because they are kind of fixed anyway, right? And like,
Yeah.
it's not
Well,
ideal, but it's also not terrible.
The issue with half is that the language doesn't consider it a primitive yet. So you can only get the size in an unsafe context.
Well, you can do Marshall.sizeOf, which is safe, but you can't use the size of keyword and let that be a const.
Yeah, but Marshall's an unsafe equivalent though, so I don't think we want to push people toward using it.
Also,
Yeah,
like, I remember that Jan
Unsafe.sizeof is the better.
told me that Marshall.sizeOf and sizeof return different values.
They can, yeah.
For blittable types like half, they will always be the same.
Yeah, obviously.
But Marshall size of will also not be a JIT time constant, and is quite a bit slower than unsafe.sizeof, which is just size of, but without needing the unsafe keyword.
Right. Yeah, I mean, honestly, for primitives, I don't care. People hard code it to 2. I mean, like, these things will never change. I mean, if the code is correct, it will be correct forever, right? So it's fine. If the code is not correct, well, then they will find out quickly that what they wrote is not really legal.
Indeed. I mean, we sort of, in the book, in the explanation, it sort of hand-wavily justifies that we were comfortable doing it because you could use the size of keyword on these types, and we can't for half, but
Well,
maybe
someday
can
we might be
eventually.
able to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, they would presumably just need to add this type to their list of types that they say, fine, I won't produce the warning for size of here. So,
Or we just convince Jared to finally convince LDM to allow size of in any context, even though for non-primitive types, it's really only useful for unsafe stuff.
well, because does size of turn into a const, or is it embedded as a call to size of?
Well, it's an IL instruction size of,
Okay.
which the JIT will treat as a const, but which
Sure.
the C#
Because it's
compiler-
constant in a given execution, but it is not constant at compile.
Yeah.
Especially if you're composed of some other type that you can't control. But
What?
So would we also use this issue to add stuff to binary reader, binary writer, or not, per my comment at the end of the issue? Because it's kind of a sister class to binary primitives.
Yeah, let's take a look. I mean, like, why not?
Because so binary reader, binary writer are basically a way to do serialization of sorts of primitives. You're writing primitives like int, string, whatever to a stream, or reading those primitives from a stream. Binary primitives just works over a span instead of a stream, but it's the same concept.
Source.net is broken right now, again, for corelib.
Yay.
See, that's the good thing with my stuff. My stuff is just outdated, but it's never broken.
It frequently doesn't answer.
Well, yeah, you just have to press F5 like F5 a few times. That's just normal. The server crashes sometimes, but like it's never completely done. Yeah, I guess having a read half seems reasonable, right?
Yeah, it matches the existing APIs like read string, read double, read int32, and so on.
And
It looks like it has all of the numeric types, including decimal, as read already on binary reader. So
Yeah.
adding half seems consistent.
and remind me, how do we implement the virtual by default?
It goes byte by byte.
We basically do read byte, and then we just
Yeah.
shut
That's how
them
all the
XOR
other
together.
virtuals. Yeah, that's how all the other virtuals are implemented. The only abstract member on here, the only thing you actually have to implement if you subclass this, is the give me the next byte method.
Gotcha.
Well,
then-
and half can also be implemented as using the ushort implementation and then reinterpret casting to half.
I don't think we would actually implement it that way, because I think we'd want our implementation to be consistent with everything else. But yeah, that would be a valid implementation.
Okay, so I presume that we don't need any of the span or array overloads. So we would only have the read half and write overloads then.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other like primitive reading or writing APIs. I mean, I guess there's always stuff like we implemented half.parse, right? So that's already there. UTF-8 parser, UTF-8 writer, maybe, but they're kind
Yeah.
of in a class of their own.
Yeah, those public.
The parse methods are public on half, but we don't have the UTF-8 equivalents public yet.
JSON, everything.
Yeah, there's a number of places where we could expose half overloads as well.
I mean, in JSON, it's kind of hand-wavy because we also don't do all the other primitives either, right? Because, you know, what's a primitive in JSON, right?
I think it does. UTF-8, JSON, reader.
Does it do short byte, S byte? I don't
It
know.
has get single and get decimal, and S byte, and yeah, it has all the numeric primitives
Fair enough.
on the reader.
I can take a work item to basically scour the framework for everywhere where we support double and single, and come up with a proposal for where we may want to add half.
Yeah, it looks like JSON element also does all the types.
I think that's a good idea, Tanner.
Yeah.
No, he didn't say scout, he said scour. He's going to file the framework down.
Fair enough.
Just hot water and a Brillo pad. Sorry, that's a trademark. Hot water and a scouring pad.
This is also why I had to take my camera feed down because there was, copyrighted images in the background.
Yeah.
Mine's off because the rest of you guys have yours off.
Well, mine is off because if mine is on, I cannot work. Plus, you can't see it anyways. I mean, you can see it, but the rest of the YouTube can't.
It's tiny, but it's there.
Well, I actually clipped that off because that looks ugly. Yeah, Kevin is saying there's also everything on System.Convert. Yeah.
Convert's going to be hard because we can't.
There's no
'cause
type code for it. That's the weird
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, so-
iConvertible doesn't have. It's just from type and to type, so
Yeah.
we could make those things work. But yeah, it would be really ugly.
I explicitly left iConvertible off of half because the way iConvertible is designed is it doesn't work well with anything that's not a primitive type without a type code. So I think for new primitives moving forward, we probably don't want to use it or necessarily convert.
So why does it not work well? I mean, like it just means you have to go via the type route, right? But I mean, we can implement it via the type check, and we can convert the conversions to the other ones that have a type code, and we can have a top level static method on convert still, right?
Yeah, but then you have the issue of converting back to half as well, and converting from any other types that users may support on iConvertible. I think it's just one of those things that's not necessarily a well-designed API, and so it's not really usable in the general sense, much like
I mean,
iClonable.
It's well designed if what you're working with is, comms variant type.
Yeah, like I don't understand the concern though. Like I mean, what prevents us from supporting it? I mean, yes, you have to go via the type thing, but like there's an extension point for arbitrary types, right? So what's the problem with it?
Isn't that potentially a breaking change for anyone who
No, it just
has
means
those other types?
no, because you basically the contract of the method is they give you a type to convert to, and if you don't know, you return false. Or whatever the contract of the method is, throwing an exception or returning
Right,
null or whatever the thing is.
So that's the general problem, is iConvertible itself only supports converting to a limited set of primitive types. And so you can't use it for the reverse, like converting single to half. And then
No, it has
like,
two type, right? You have to implement two type, and two type is basically I give you the type to convert to, and then you're free to not do that. And I believe I think the contract is you can return null. I believe that's the way it is. Docs iConvertible. I mean, that's how I supported on my types because they clearly didn't have type codes either.
it does not specify.
Maybe you expect it to throw. Fuck, where's the two type? Wow, that's a well-documented API then.
It's because it works for the scenario it was intended for, which is comms variant type. Seriously.
Yeah, I'm curious now what we actually do in the framework. Whether we return null or throw.
We're supposed to throw an invalid cast exception. If you go to the main documentation, there's remarks that detail it.
What do you see there?
Remarks on the main page for iConvertible. If there's no meaningful conversion to a common language runtime type, then a particular interface method implementation throws invalid cast exception.
Cool.
Yep, I see that from the reference source as well. Because source.net is not working, but reference source.microsoft.com is.
Well, it never has to get updated, so.
Yeah, it's easy for them, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, this thing has existed since .NET 1.0, right? So there's no, it's not like any implementations changed in here.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, what happens on the other ones? I mean, it's the same behavior, right? If I call 2-day time and I pass in a byte, we probably throw the exception as well, right? There's no query mechanism. I mean, so that still would work, right?
Correct. Most of them throw invalid cast exception.
And then presumably the existing implementations we have don't just handle type code either, right? Probably the two type implementation handles the equivalent type codes as well, right?
Well, every implementation of iConvertible to type that I've found just calls convert.default to type.
Yeah. The other thing about iConvertible is if we implement that, we're also going to want to make sure that things like data table can support it, sending it up to and down from SQL. We want to make sure XML serializer can support it and so on. Like, was any of that tested with this type?
Nope. Because right now it's just a basic interchange type.
Yeah.
It probably doesn't matter either, right? I mean, like, I think, like, to me, it's kind of more important that we can convert the normal primitives in the same way.
Right.
But even convert, we could decide not to do it via the interface. We just support the static methods on convert. I mean, that's still available. It seems a bit dumb that I can't convert a byte to a half.
Yeah, I mean, we'd probably...
you can, you
add
just...
Yeah, okay, I cast it up,
type.
fair enough. But, like...
Right.
Let's say an into and half and it's in the right value range would be nice to have, right?
Yeah. So, but by the way, Tanner, is I know we're kind of getting off track here, but is serializing this an instance of system half through something like XML serializer, which is still a supported serializer? Like, is that an interesting scenario that people might want to do?
As interesting as serializing float or double is.
Which are fully supported.
Right.
It's exciting.
He means interesting in both cases, or in both meanings of the term.
Like, yes, you can serialize it, and you may want to serialize it because you may want to store it in XML or JSON or CSV, etc.
Mhm.
Just because you generally want to serialize primitive values like this.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like XML serializer uses duck typing of if you have a toString and a parse, then you just work. Because it's a code generator.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Alrighty. So we skip this one. We should do this one.
I think the stack trace one is supposed to be fairly simple.
So this one here is also very simple. It's just a question of whether we think it's the right fix. So the fundamental problem goes like this. You start a new process. By default, what we do on Windows at least is that we inherit the handles. So now you launch one instance of the app. It starts listening on the port. Now it starts launching a process to Notepad. Now you terminate your app. Now you relaunch your app. And if you haven't terminated Notepad, the port is now blocked because Notepad inherited the handle for the port. So the proposal is to actually have an API on startup info to say, do you want to inherit handles? We default it to true because that's the current behavior. Setting is Windows specific, and you can set it to false.
And what would this do on non-Windows?
It just does nothing.
Because they're not inherited by default?
Either that or, hold on.
I mean, yeah. Presumably it would PNSE. That's usually what we mean when we slap minimum OS on something.
Yeah, I think there was an issue with Linux in particular where I forgot what the behavior is. I think so. I mean, so the problem goes like this, right? Like if we say it's a no-op, then basically setting it to false would be fine. Setting it to true would be problematic. In which case, maybe we should not have the attribute. Maybe we should just have an analyzer that says, well, if you set it to false, it's fine. That's still cross-platform. But if we set it to true, then you're Windows only. Which is also somewhat weird because the default is true. And then on Linux, we would default it to false anyway. So it's a bit of a...
Well, can't you inherit handles on Unix as well?
So that's what I'm saying. I don't know what the default is. Like if the default is it's a no-op, then what I said is true. If the default is true, then same argument holds, except that setting it to true is now cross-platform, but setting it to false wouldn't be, right?
Well, I mean, sort of on Linux, you inherit all the handles, and then because you call fork first, and then when you call execve, it closes all open handles and dumps all your executable pages and then starts over. So I don't think we have any option that lets it pass through. The execve is very complicated, so presumably one can say that they want to just change what the entry point is and start running from the entry point without closing any handles. But what in the world state would your process be in? So, so I don't know if it's possible to do or not, but I think the problem with having this thing and having the default say true is that it's not true on Linux. So we need the default to be OS specific, which is weird because we would want, if we could make it work on Linux, we don't want to change the behavior.
Well, but that is kind of like almost orthogonal, right? Because that's today's world already.
No, I'm saying, but if on Linux we have it return true by default and the setter throws, it's actually lying because you're not really, you can't witness the handles being inherited.
No, I get that. All I'm saying is that, like, to a certain extent, whether we expose the property or not, we already have discrepancy in behavior, right?
Depends. If you're talking about sockets, that was already changed in 3.0 to be consistent across both Linux and Windows.
Well, it's whether or not the handles are inherited by default is already different. And I'm saying we should not have it default to true. We should have it default to the correct thing for the platform. And if we're not comfortable having it default to the correct thing for the platform, then we should not add it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Or
yeah, no,
we should
that
add
seems
it
yes.
nullable. And null means do whatever is right for the platform, and then setting it to anything non-null on Linux would throw or whatever.
Actually, that might not be unreasonable, right? I mean, in fact, we could say you can never set it.
Well, the whole point is somebody wants to be able to not do it on, or to set it to false on Windows, right?
Right, like, but that's what I'm saying. You would just mark the setter as platform specific. You would say it's not nullable. It's just you can observe what the behavior is, and you can only set it on Windows. Right, so it's possible that on, let's say on Linux, we inherit handles by default, but on macOS we don't for some stupid reason, but we cannot set it on either one of them. So it would still be available to expose what the behavior is, but you wouldn't be able to customize it necessarily.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm pointing out where the comment here says defaults to true.
Yeah.
If we're exposing it as a non-nullable, it should default to whatever the honest answer is.
Yes, I agree with that.
Or using enum, but yeah. Enum, nullable, bool, whatever, yeah.
True, false, found, not found, right?
I mean, true, false, and platform default.
Right, and on the one hand, that is bad because you're using it as a Trullian, but the null behavior is I don't have an opinion, and so it is. It also makes sense with nullable. It's not just being a quick 3-state value.
So what I found from a quick search is that Linux by default POSIX for fork will clone most file descriptors and locks except for a couple that explicitly calls out, unless you set the close on exec flag, in which case all file descriptors will be closed once the forked process starts executing.
Yeah, and I fair enough. So I guess your statement is we could just stop asserting close on exec if someone set it to.
Right,
true. But
we might also need to do more investigation and stuff, and there may be platforms in the future that don't support it. So I think the nullable's right, but we may want to do some initial investigation before this is implemented to determine the right behavior on Unix.
So why is nullable sensible?
It just covers whatever the default for the platform is, with you being able to query it.
Yeah, but then why is nullable? Why would it be nullable? You would just say you can't set it, but you can ask what the platform provided behavior is.
Oh, okay, fair.
And whether you can actually influence it might be platform specific, right? Like on some platforms you might, on others you might not. So who owns the area? Does anybody know? Who owns I/O?
This isn't I/O. This is diagnostics process, right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that's I/O, but you just put it in the wrong namespace. What is that? Runtime.
Let's see here. We're all racing to find it. Adam Sitnick and Eric T.
Adam's on vacation, but Eric's in.
Yes.
Yeah, let's just tag both of them and then see. Let's approve it, assuming that's the thing. Okay, let's remove this one here. Who's the other? Was it Eric?
Yeah.
Bless you. All right, diagnostic stack trace hidden attribute. Assume that means if you mark a method like this, it doesn't show up in stack traces?
Right. So my understanding is this is currently internal and the request is for it to be public. And it would just allow external users to also hide their own methods.
I don't understand the last comment. Like, how does this relate to does not return attribute? That seems kind of independent.
That I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I have zero problem with that. I mean, that seems usable. I like the namespace. Undecided on the name, but what does it mean to apply to a struct though? That I don't understand.
I think for class and struct, it just applies to everything in it. So no members from it show in the stack trace.
Oh. Okay, then I don't understand why you can't mark properties though, or events for that matter. I guess events don't matter. I guess yeah, events. Yeah, I guess events would also show up if you throw
Well,
from the arrow remover.
Yeah, methods do cover properties and structs. They just apply to the individual, or properties and events. It just applies to the individual get, set, add, remove rather than the entire thing. If we've got it for class and struct, I would think property and event would be fine as well, as would interface, considering we've got dims now. I'd imagine that this set is here because that's what
we currently have. Yeah.
that's what the current internal type has, and that's likely all we've needed it for our own stuff.
Somebody says, "Hey, it's my request." Hey, John. Hope you like the resolution. What else do we have in attribute targets? Attribute targets. So
there's also like assembly and module, but those are probably why are you hiding everything from your assembly from the stack trace?
Yeah, those seem like if you do these things, you're doing something really bad. Like I don't want to help you with that.
Class and struct at least makes sense because that covers, for example, all your throw helpers.
So field and generic parameter clearly don't make sense.
Nor does delegate.
Delegate also seems fishy.
Or parameter or return value.
Yeah, I don't know if I would put it on constructor either. Like constructors tend to be important.
So it would need to be. It needs to stay on constructor because we currently use it on constructor somewhere.
Oh, okay.
delegate might actually make sense if you wanted to hide the invoke method.
But that's runtime implemented anyway. How would you ever see that?
No, the actual invoke method exists in IL. I don't know if they currently show up, but they do show there.
Yeah, and I think you can be a very complicated person and extend delegate and make something with an invoke method, and now it is a delegate.
Yep.
I guess, but it seems super marginal.
Yeah, it might be. I think it makes sense, but it could also just be something where if someone asks for it and has a valid use case, we extend the metadata in the future.
Yeah.
Because the real problem is saying something like delegate gets it might change how the stack walker has to resolve the attribute. Like anywhere that we're expanding the usage here, we have to actually add a test to make sure it works.
Yeah, let's maybe not do that. Let's just add it in the list and say should we, basically. So we already talked about class. We already talked about, so constructor's already in. I added delegate. Enum doesn't make sense. Event we asked. Interface we asked. Method is already handled.
Right. So interface I would say no to. And if they want it on DIMs, they can apply it to all the individual methods on the DIMs, because that would give a very weird impression that if you called, if you put it on iConvertible, that calling iConvertible.convert to int16 should not show up, but that you probably didn't actually call it from the interface. Like
that's really no different than an abstract class, though.
I'm just saying it feels misleading to me if it's applied to it, like that people would easily get confused.
It is kind of not the same as an abstract class, though, because if you are applying to the abstract class, it's very clear that it applies to all members of that particular type. With interfaces, you could argue that it would apply to all interface implementations on other types as well, which wouldn't be the case. It would only apply to the DIMs you defined on the type, which is not the same thing.
Yeah, so I would leave that one off until there's a massive request for it. But as long as DIMs are being relatively rare, then it's okay. You applied it to two method bodies instead of to one interface declaration. So it's not a whole lot of extra control V-ing.
All right, then, so one thing I wanted to check is, so system diagnostics, what's in there? System diagnostics. Do we have anything else with stack traces today? I don't think so, right? Where's our, stuff with, hiding from unit testing and shit? Is that in system diagnostics somewhere else?
What do you mean hiding from unit testing?
There is this thing of debugger step through. There's don't show it. Don't use it when you compute code coverage. Where are these attributes?
Oh yeah, like debugger display, stuff like that. Debugger hidden.
No, I mean more like the attribute you apply to a method for the method to not be part of the computation for code coverage.
Debugger step through is in system diagnostics, but I think the two most telling things are, one, this is an internal type that someone just wants to change internal to public, and two, the stack trace class that lets you just build a stack trace to here without throwing an exception, is also in system diagnostics.
Yeah, the one I'm thinking of was exclude from code coverage, and that one we put in system diagnostics or code analysis, which kind of makes sense for code coverage because it's basically analysis, but I think this one wouldn't make sense in code analysis.
Yeah, I agree. This isn't a code coverage related thing.
And then debugger hidden is probably the closest analogy, and that one would also be in diagnostics. So yeah, I think that fits.
Mm-hmm.
Stack trace hidden. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. The same as debugger hidden, right? So also the naming seems to be consistent with what we have. All right, then. I don't want.
Hooray!
I don't want to prescribe implementation, so. All right, so.
But as an attribute, you should prescribe the implementation of the
I guess
default
I should.
CTOR.
I guess I should. All right, so that is some JSON DCLS stuff. Wow, that's quite a bit of API service.
If we already have string, then adding Ross char seems totally legit.
Yeah, I mean, we use read-only span of char as basically the equivalent of string, right?
Yep.
So is there any, I guess the benefit is you don't have to slice, right? Sorry,
Right.
that you can't slice.
There are overloads that take ROS of byte, so yeah, may as well do ROS of char as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're doing Ross byte as we don't have UTF-8 string or Ross char 8.
Yeah, I guess what I meant is as opposed to read-only memory of char, because there are already APIs that take spans instead of memories.
Okay. Yeah. For the span versus memory. Yeah. I mean, they are synchronous functions, so span is more appropriate than memory. Meaning they produce a single result and don't leave ambient state, or don't produce a result that is the ambient state.
Yeah, the declarations make sense to me.
Yeah, it looks exactly like he took the string one and replaced string with Ross char, which seems like an easy okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this looks fine to me.
Ah, Corey, how's life?
Hey guys.
He's been here a while. Do you never look at your screen?
No.
Now you're asking him to like multitask 5 different things all at once.
Yeah, it's like I'm happy that I can edit and and do the rest without messing up.
Well, at least when I'm presenting, I often end up looking at the stream view to see if there are comments coming in from chat. And
yeah, that's what I have in OBS. So, but in
Yeah,
OBS
that's
I
it.
don't see. Yeah, I guess I see. On
I
the
was gonna say
left-hand side.
when Corey joined, it changed the layout on the left. So
Yeah, but
Yeah,
so
that's how I
tiny.
knew that he joined.
All right, so done. So
as we tell the world that after 5 months of being forced to work from home, we still don't know how computers work. Okay.
So add the ability to parse format a flow double from hexadecimal literal. I think that's
Right.
What?
So
tenor
so
space, yeah.
the IEEE spec defines a hexadecimal format. The primary benefit of which is that the value parsed is always exactly representable. So you don't have issues like, oh, I typed 0.1 and I actually got 0.1, lots of zeros, 555. The hexadecimal representation is always an exact representation of the float. It's defined by the spec. It's supported by many other languages, including C, C++. I believe Rust supports it. I believe Java supports it now as well. So this isn't necessarily as much of a there's a minor addition to number styles proposed here, and then we would also be extending single, double, and half to support the X format specifier.
So if I were to call int.parse, pass in hex float, and the number that came in actually was a whole integer without any floating or without any decimal at the end, would it parse correctly? Is that the idea?
I feel like number style allow hex specifier is number styles I am hexadecimal. I think.
So for so the hex format for float is slightly different from integer hex format in that it can also have decimal points and exponents.
Right, and I guess I was asking if the floating point hexadecimal value when parsed does in fact represent a whole integer that fits within the domain of a 32-bit int, would int.parse parse this correctly? Like if I were to pass hex float into int.parse blah blah blah, like
And
is it always going to throw?
And it contained no decimal.
Correct.
Then int.parse would parse it, and I believe they represent the same number.
I guess I don't remember if int.parse allows the 0x leading prefix or not, or if it says the x is not a valid character.
That might be the case.
But you'll notice that, like, hex float isn't a new value, it's just a new combination of existing values.
Right.
Yeah.
So int would see this as allow hex specifier, so it's going to be in hex mode. It'll either throw because you passed allow decimal point, or it won't. And then it'll do the other things that it would do.
Yeah, my gut feel is it will probably reject a low decimal point.
Wait, are you saying the int would or the float would?
The int would.
Yeah, the int would reject it if it had the decimal point. I think it would reject it if you had the 0x prefix.
But to be clear, the decimal point is, I mean, it's like if you parse a number styles that has a low decimal point set, I think int.parse throws argument out of range or argument exception. I don't think
no, it does not actually. It works, yeah.
Okay.
At least in full framework, because that's the only thing I can look at right now.
Yeah, full framework says allow decimal point is totally valid as a number style for int.
Cool.
It probably then doesn't do anything useful with it.
Probably means it has to be 0. Or it does rounding.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, to me, these are the kind of changes that I think are generally fine. Like, if you pass in a new modifier to an existing API, I mean, we can choose to do whatever we want. We can reject it, we can implement it. Like, that's not...
Yeah, I mean, we technically have to call this a breaking change.
Yeah, which would be okay. Because
double.toString x presumably currently prints the letter x, and now it will do something different. So it is an observable. It is a thing that didn't throw that now produces a different result.
So is that the behavior for format specifiers? If you don't know it, you take it as a literal?
Yep.
Who specified that? That's like a...
I don't know. Who would have been a PM in 1.0? Guthrie?
Yeah, and it's actually rather annoying because that means if you type something like G100,
and you fucked
where
up. Yeah.
Then you actually get the literal G100 back. You don't.
Cool.
Where you might want to, for example, have 100 digits of precision, which is valid for float and double. Which there's actually a separate proposal for that.
Yeah. So so since this would change the functional behavior of double.toString.
So actually, double.toString of x right now throws a format exception.
Oh,
okay.
Cool. Then it's not a breaking change.
Yeah.
Throw to not throw is, unless it's security code, not a breaking change.
Can you check for single as well while you're at it?
Sure. Same thing.
Cool.
Fair enough. Then otherwise it would just be taking things that are throwing and making them not throw, which, I mean, we can certainly put it in the new features in, assume this will be 6, list. We just don't need to put it on the things to look out for when you upgrade that might hurt you, aka breaking changes.
I mean, if you do it early in 6, I also don't care, quite frankly, because if it is a problem, people will tell us.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't expect most people would care that, assuming that the X specifier printed an X, which is what I had expected. I assume most people wouldn't test that, and most people wouldn't care, but the one person who cares would be upset that we didn't document the breaking change.
So I guess one remaining question is, given that allow hex specifier today explicitly calls out a string that is parsed with cannot be prefixed with 0x, should maybe we also add another thing called allow hex prefix that does allow 0x to be prefixed?
I mean, I'm kind of indifferent on that one because I think it's okay to say the type that you give allow hex specifier can I mean, they don't have to be uniform, right? Hex specifier for int can mean something different than it does for float and single, right?
Yeah.
For float and double.
I mean, we would want to bump the documentation to say except for floating point types where it's required.
Well,
and-
you could also foresee that parse, for example, doesn't require the 0x for the float literal because it's able to differentiate based on the fact you explicitly passed in allow hex number.
Does the IEEE spec say that it starts with a 0x?
Yes, so do the C
Alright,
sharp
there you
and
go.
the C++
Then-
specs for
Then don't sniff.
hexadecimals.
If you're saying you're adding it because it meets the definition of a spec, then don't add sniffing.
But I like having a lowercase h at the end of my literal instead of a 0x at the beginning.
All right.
Do we
Your
support
payroll,
this
please
format
divide
as a
Levi's
literal in
salary
C
by
sharp?
10.
No, we don't support it in C sharp today.
Yeah, I mean, like we could allow hex prefix, and then plumb that through everything, or we just change a sentence in documentation.
I mean, the question really comes down to the other side, which is if we don't do it now, I don't think we get to do it later, because if we add an allow hex prefix later, you really want hex float to probably have that value set, but you don't want to change the definition of what hex float is today. So it really, I think, comes down to whether we ever want to do this.
I think having the allowance of a hex prefix would be general goodness, as it would also allow you to parse a hex string, an integer hex string, without requiring you to first check for 0x and then split 2.
Yeah, I
Or
agree
slice
with that.
2.
I do agree with that. It's just the only thing that makes me a little nervous here is that I would nominally expect allow prefix to mean that the prefix is optional, whereas here the prefix would be mandated.
Yeah.
Well, we could say for if we have it, we could say for float, if it's hex number, if it's hex float, then because allow hex specifier is really just I am a hex number. You must interpret me as a hex number.
Yeah,
It's
that
just
one's not
badly
actually
worded.
allow.
Yeah, it's you must treat me as a hex number.
Sure.
I mean, the way I
in
see
which
this,
case-
like, I mean, the allow ones to me just control what you let go with parsing, and then once you've done that, then it's still validation, right? It's the same with an int. I mean, you just say, allow numbers or whatever, but clearly when there is like, when the number is too large, we still validate that, but the number styles don't express that either, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't say, there's no such thing as like, enforce 32-bit.
Right, but the other allows, so allow exponent, okay, maybe not that one. Allow currency symbol, allow parentheses, allow leading sign. These are all things that are allow in that they're not required.
Right.
But the hex specifier one, it says it's allow hex specifier, but it doesn't allow a specifier at all, which would be the 0x prefix. It says this is hex.
Right.
So it was named poorly.
Why not literally call any new field allow leading 0x?
I mean, we could, but then again, now it's the fun. I guess really that would be double double.parse would throw if you said allow hex specifier but didn't say allow hex prefix.
I would actually,
yeah,
I would ignore that. Like I guess if you had a field called allow leading 0x, that would always have to be specified with allow hex specifier, because there's no other valid combination of that.
Well, and that depends on if you want it to sniff.
Well, it's not sniffing either.
You can't sniff.
It's not sniffing at all. The allow hex specifier means this must be a hex number, which then you just have either I allow the prefix or I don't, in which case you allow 3EDP minus 1, or you require 0x 3EDP minus 1. There's no sniffing or guessing or anything else. It's allow hex specifier means this must be a hex number, and allow hex prefix means you allow 0x to be before it.
If you did allow hex prefix but didn't say allow hex specifier to int, does that mean that it will read a 0x and then switch to hex mode, or does that mean it throws as an invalid combination of, or invalid number styles value?
I would say it would throw.
Yeah, I would say that allow hex prefix is some it forces allow hex specifier as well, basically.
I mean, we can express that, right? I mean, we could make the new thing a combination of a new bit plus allow hex specifier.
Yeah.
We could. It would two-string weird.
Well, it depends on where you sort it in, right? We can insert it field-wise before.
That's fair. So, yes, we could insert right before 0x200, 0x600, allow hex prefix.
I'm sure there was some zeros I agree with.
Because we don't have the thing that I'll terribly call 400. So like that's where the next flag is available. But
I mean, how many flags do we have left? We have enough left, right?
We haven't even broken 16 bits yet, so we have a lot left.
Yeah, so in that sense, I think I'm okay with what Tanner suggested.
Especially the thing that makes this really weird, especially, is when you have allow leading sign and allow hex specifier, because now if you want to allow 0x inside the string and we didn't include inbox support for it, you now have to manually parse out the sign yourself before passing the rest of the data to us, which means that you're doing like a multi-substring split now, which is just a pain in the ass, really hard to get right.
I mean, it's been true for 20 years, but
it has. But I mean, our job should be to make people's lives easier, right?
Sure. Yeah. So
then the conclusion is we will have. What did we say we will do? We will say hex float will imply. No, actually, I lost it now. Tanner, repeat what you just described.
Allow hex prefix will imply allow hex specifier.
Allow hex prefix will imply.
And subnote, allow hex specifier is a terrible name.
Yeah.
So is allow hex prefix if it's actually require hex prefix.
Well, it's not require except for floating point.
Yeah. Well, no, I thought we said that for floating point, allow is just allow for the prefix, because you don't have to sniff. There's no guesswork.
I thought that we said that the actual string representation always mandates the 0x prefix per IEEE.
The IEEE spec says it must always be there, but the common representation for hexadecimal integers also says there must be a prefix or a suffix to differentiate.
No, that's the common representation in various programming languages, but there's no like spec that's language independent that says that, is there?
I'm sure there is a standard somewhere that specifies the proper representation of hexadecimals.
If that was the case, then the debugger wouldn't print it as like 43H.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like, I think that, allow hex specifier wasn't allow, and we all agree that it's not an allow. It was, and it's terribly named. So I'm saying if we think that the behavior that we are going to do for int is the hex prefix means it's if you spec the flag, then it must be part of the string. Then we shouldn't call it allow. And if it's actually optional, then we should call it allow.
Yeah. And I was saying, let it actually be optional. That way you can specify it if you want to support 0x or if you want to optionally support it. And then for float, you can just say, by default, it's there. But if the user, so hex float would include it. But if
what happens when you call double dot toString of x? Presumably that's something that should be parsable using
by default
hex float.
By default it would return 0x.
But int dot toString of x does not do that.
Correct.
Correct.
So why the discrepancy?
Well, hex float will be consistent with what float does, and hex number is consistent with what int does.
Yeah. I was saying do it like that because so the spec formally says you must have it. But it's reasonable to say, given that it's just allow, that you could support parsing without it. And there's no guesswork involved there as to what it is. So it's reasonable to say you could parse without it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the question, I was about to say, like, just because the spec says this must be there doesn't mean that you're not allowed to parse it if it's not there, right?
That's the type of thing that tends to get us into trouble.
Yeah. It's a thing that's super cute when we do it now, and in 10 years, someone will be cursing the fact that we did it because now we have to support it and can't call some other library that would do it faster or better or according to some better standard.
Yeah. So concrete example, JSON 2 comes around and the JSON 2 spec mandates that 0x is present on hexadecimal floats, and the naive implementation is to call float.parse hex number, whatever, or hex float. Like, does that now allow anything? Does it now allow values to come through that didn't have the 0x prefix, unbeknownst to the caller? Like that, there's weirdness there.
That would be an issue with the parser. The parser would need to do an additional validation of, yes, it contains the 0x.
But that's a pit of failure though for callers. Like the caller no reasonable caller would have known that they needed to do that additional validation.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, a reasonable developer would have added a negative test, but
sure.
So what is the conclusion then?
I mean, so my only opinion is if we call it allow, it needs to mean allow, and if we want it to be required if the bit is set, then we should not call it allow. I am ambivalent as to the implementation detail, and I don't know if I like the notion that float adds this new format and allows a variant of the format just because we can.
I don't have a particularly strong opinion, but I think having the allow hex is better for the ecosystem as a whole. Just for integers and other things, I know every time I encounter it, I have to remember to strip the 0x.
Yeah, I agree. We should definitely do that for integers at minimum.
Right. Well, I think we should add a flag. The question is, should it be require hex prefix or should it be allow hex prefix?
Yeah. And I think allow works better
like
for the
both.
ecosystem.
Yeah, I was actually thinking maybe we want two flags. One is allow and the other is require.
Because it seems like this float, we should require it, but integers just allow it.
I mean,
Yeah.
what if you just say, screw it, this hex float is not a combination of existing flags, it's a completely new flag. And we also add, and then we can say, we are free to add a low hex prefix later. Because we don't have to express it as a combination of existing ones.
I mean, the hex float format seems like it's supposed to be very exact, so that wouldn't be the worst thing.
I mean, you'd want some white space and sign handling, but
Yeah.
Actually, you probably don't even need allow sign because it's part of the format itself.
Yeah, but then you get into the issue of users who want to construct their own. Now you have to handle that.
Well, but I mean,
Construct their own what?
I would say like it needs to be reasonable to say hex float is a completely new bit, by default, it basically just says, yes, you need to have the valid IEEE standard, which may or may not include trailing white space or leading white space. Assuming it doesn't, well, then the user would just say hex float or allow leading white or allow trailing white. And if they don't specify it, well, then by default, it's whatever the IEEE standard says.
Yeah, the IEEE standard has no concept of leading or trailing anything.
Well, perfect.
Right.
Then then it's a completely separate flag, and that flag requires to be in hex, but we don't have to express it over the allow hex specifier.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly do both an exact thing and a friendly thing, and we could add a flag, so a new bit that is, hex, or IEEE 754 hex float, and then we add hex float. So obviously the first one needs a better name then, which is allow leading and trailing white space, and the other format specifier.
I think this is getting overly complicated for something that's largely just, should we allow a slight variant that doesn't require the 0x prefix?
Fair. I mean, like it is, but the float hex is different than int hex, right? Like it's not really just allowing a decimal point and hex, because it's got the weird like ease. Well, I guess ease probably means ease. So what the p?
Yeah, the only difference is you allow a decimal, and you allow an exponent, and that's the only difference.
But the exponent is specified by p instead of e.
Right, because e is a hex character.
Right.
So, sorry, the existing float one, is that a combination of flags, or is that just a disjoint value?
It's a combination.
What is the combination of?
Leading and trailing white space, leading sign, allow decimal point, and allow an exponent.
Yeah, basically
Which
everything.
that exponent means scientific notation.
Yeah, basically everything here that isn't hex specifier.
Interesting. So then I come back to the thing that Tanner originally said, like, do we then care that it's exactly spec compliance? Because it seems like these things are not like this, right? These things are, here's a bunch of strings or here's a bunch of configuration that allows us to parse the spec format, but we will parse more than that, right? Because we also allow white space. In which case,
So-
I'm okay with saying we have allow
Right, so
hex prefix.
I would be okay with. I think it would make sense to say that we add it as described. We don't support not having the 0x lead in, and if we choose to add a allow hex prefix bit, that bit is simply ignored in double because the prefix is required by the format. Then we could add allow hex prefix and make life easier for int and the other types, but for the floating types, it's simply implied by hex specifier because it's required by their hex format. Because
I'm okay
the
with
p
that.
is only valid in decimal hex; it's not valid in int hex.
Well, what if we said hex number by default doesn't have allow and it requires, but if someone explicitly ors allow in, then it's allowed?
Do we have examples of people using it without the specifier in the wild?
I think the C++ spec supports both the 0x prefix and an H postfix.
I would be okay with, I think, Tanner's proposal just now. If you or in a flag that says, oh, by the way, this is optional. On the way that flag would be interpreted by int is the prefix is optional, and the way that it would be interpreted by float is the same. The prefix is optional. Yeah.
So for int, it moves it from prohibited to permitted, or optionally permitted, and for double, it moves it from required to optional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's It does make it optional. I agree with
does.
that.
Yeah. And you could imagine if there's sufficient demand, then we could also have an optional H postfix flag or something in the future. Like we've left our options open to do that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's fine to leave our options open, and I wouldn't push back on if we wanted to just implement it like that right away, but it still seems weird because this seems to be a well-defined format.
I could imagine for people who need to represent this in the smallest possible fashion while still being text as opposed to binary, maybe they would want to strip out the 0x.
Yeah. So I think that the thing that we're spending a lot of time on is what does the allow mean for the prefix, and I think we've said that we now understand a world that we could make allow work as a prefix, but we can make the proposal as written work without adding that new flag.
Yes.
Yes, and I think the conclusion is also if we ever added it, it would be in a bit that is separate from hex float anyway. So, and this is we can do it in the future.
Hex float would not include allow hex prefix because hex float by default is require hex prefix, and then if you did hex float pipe allow hex prefix, then now it moves into it will do the optional. It will move it from required to optional.
Yeah, whereas with int, it would move it from not allowed to optional.
So there's a path forward that doesn't require redefining the accelerator pattern thing for hex float. So I think that means we're saying approved as is, and for in the future, someone can try bringing forward the proposal for allow hex prefix.
Okay, I'll open a proposal for the second one after API review today, if someone on YouTube doesn't do it first.
Because, ideally it would just need to call through is it going to force the allow hex specifier, making sure that we have, essentially it needs a spec because it's changing very deep down plumbing, and not just an API proposal. Because what we were getting bogged down on was details.
Yeah.
Not shape. So it needs a spec. But thing.
Yeah. I would very much be a proponent of Tanner's proposal to make 0x work on int with an optional flag.
Yeah, it's fine. Just somebody needs to write down when we add that, does it force allow hex specifier, or does it mean that we now have content type detection, or what?
Sure.
And,
yeah.
And all the stuff that bubbles out from adding this new thing.
I'm just saying that I'm going to bake Tanner a cake or something when he writes that and brings it forward to review.
Fair enough.
Right. So this one, then we can approve without spec, right? That's fair, right?
I think that this one is well defined enough as it will support the strict interpretation of IEEE 754 2019 hex format.
It's always funny that you find the typos after you posted the comment.
I also realized that the other proposal related to this one wasn't marked API ready for review, so I did that. So when we get through these current ones, if we do, you should refresh the API review page.
I mean, is it something that's best to do while we have this still paged in?
It has to do with float parsing and formatting still.
Which one is it?
30657.
This one here?
Yep.
See, this is the kind of bike shedding I expect from this group, and it's great.
So for this proposal, basically today, the format specifier limits itself to a precision of 99. For float and double, the exact underlying representable value can be more than 99. For example, with float, it is 112 or 113, and for double, it's 767 or 8. And that's the number of significant digits in the longest representable, or in the exact representation of the underlying value. The proposal is to essentially take a breaking change here and allow us to now specify precisions to either take the breaking change and allow us to specify format specifiers with a precision greater than 99, or expose new overload that explicitly takes the precision along with a care format.
Sorry, explain to me the breaking change. Why is it a breaking change to allow for larger numbers in the format string?
Currently, double.toString quote G100 end quote produces the string G100.
Yep. Which it's not a terrible breaking change, but it is a breaking change.
That sounds
think
like the
that's
kind of thing
fine.
we would accept.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I like in framework, I think that we would be hesitant to take it because it's scary, and
But we would probably
think it
quirk
makes
it.
sense
I mean, that's
for-
the kind of thing we would historically allow when you recompile, but we would not do it in place, right? It's like a race sort, right?
yeah,
Well,
Which I think would
that's-
make the bar for core.
Another thing that gets a little weird here is if you talk about things like UTF-8 formatter, they take a struct called standard format, which stores precision as an 8-bit integer.
That's enough, hopefully, right?
No, because double is 768.7, and if we ever add quad, that's 11,000 digits.
Yes, which means that we would need to make an API change to standard format in order to allow this precision.
Or that, or have overloads of a separate type.
Well, it exposes precision as a byte.
You know, I mean, like a separate type, like a separate
Then
API
we would have
on the...
precision 16.
So
Sure.
why the heck did we do this to ourselves?
Christoph wanted to use less memory.
Yep.
But for a struct that is not allocated on the heap, why does anybody care?
A struct that's not so it fits exactly in one int is likely the reason.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we currently cap at 100, so why would we need to go any bigger?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should just on the safe side flag this as a breaking change, and really that's more so that people, if they start straddling I mean, so let's do LTS to LTS, the 3.1 to 6 thing. It's like what we're really letting you know is G100 won't work if you go backwards.
Yeah.
And so breaking change, that won't throw on an old thing. It'll just produce nonsense.
So, but also the proposed API wouldn't be enough, right? It would be the same overload on double as well, right?
Right. Well, so if we take the breaking change, we don't need a new overload.
Yeah. This is take the technically risky but limited in scope breaking change of changing how we interpret standard format.
Right.
changes.
But all I'm saying is that if we were to do it via APIs, then we would have to add this API to single, to double, and presumably to half.
Half technically doesn't need it because half only has like 21 digits in its longest representation.
Gotcha. So like that's already covered by the regular format strings then.
Yeah.
What happens right now on half if you give it G99?
It prints the longest string, which is going to be like 21 digits.
Okay, so it parses the format specifier as G99 and then it clamps it to a sensible value, which is G21.
Yeah, or whatever the actual value
Sure.
is. I forget off the top of my head.
Right.
How dare you?
21 was in air quotes. And so we would presumably do the same thing for so we wouldn't need the new API for half because it doesn't really make sense. But if we bump the parser to however many digits we want to bump it to, we would do that with a they would just end up with the same clamping behavior.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there is one technically breaking format of this, which I think is a reason that .NET Framework is hesitant to do the format. No, because if we fail to standard format, we think it's now a custom format, but I guess it's how we do the custom formats. Anyway, I'll just say what I was going to say, and we'll see if anybody thinks it's breaking. If you had a format that you expected the G10 to print followed by like a 0, and if the change that we do to the interpreter now picks up the extra trailing information and doesn't do what it used to do. So if we never have a format that would have been misinterpreted that produced actually rendering the number, then that's fine.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the case, as if it's over 99, then we count it as a custom.
Right, but like they say here that G308 returns the string on double.max value, prints the string G, and then a bunch of stuff that is not 308. So I don't actually know what that toString is doing.
I don't either. I would have to look.
So what does G308 result in then? Is it basically G30 followed by an 8?
Because that's my concern, is if we ever have anywhere that would parse that as G30 followed by an 8, that's really why we would then really need to call it a breaking change. But
so interestingly, if I do it with basically, I'm trying it with various combinations, and it seems like only, yeah, it seems if you end it with like if you end the format specifier with 08, it interprets it differently, and I'm not sure why.
Fun times. Yeah, so definitely warrants a breaking change label. But I think that we should just take the change to the parser.
Do we? I mean, maybe it's just a very weird question, but like, would anybody ever print something with more than 100 digits?
So I have to do this all the time. I even had to do it earlier today because I was having to explain why someone's bug isn't a bug.
Well, but like, is it for demo purposes? Is it like, would you write production code that actually takes a double and prints 150 digits into memory?
No, you likely wouldn't write production code. This is you generally use this when you're debugging or doing other diagnostic work to determine what the actual rounding error in your floating point code is. For example, why does 0.1 plus 0.2 return something that does not equal 0.3?
Okay, if that's the case, then do we actually care? Because then I would argue that if it's purely for diagnostic purposes, I can totally live with an overload. Because my concern really is like, if we go down the, okay, let's just change the format specifier, then, I mean, I haven't looked recently into the implementation, but like, I could imagine a world where plumbing this thing through is hard for things like, the Christoph type, where we can only express up to a byte-sized number, right? And then is it really worth it if basically it's just for temporary stuff that somebody just wants to quickly print shit to the console? Because yeah, in that case, calling toString with like, precision of like 500 seems reasonable, right?
Yeah, I would be fine with it being a separate overload as well.
Like, to me, the format string really is valuable because if you localize, you can externalize it. It's in a centralized spot where having a separate overload is a pain in the ass now, right? But if it's literally just for debugging purposes, then I think an overload is totally reasonable for that.
Yeah, there's likely very few places where, at least I can't think of any off the top of my head, where you would actually want to print, all 768 digits in production.
I really don't understand the behavior of this thing.
Are you playing with G108?
Well, I have the number 1.1, and if I print it with G100, it writes the number G10, or it writes G101. And so G107 is then G117 is the string it prints. And every other string I try now, it just changes the 0 in the middle to a 1. This makes no sense. This is amazing. And that weird behavior is consistent between core and framework.
Yeah, I think what it's doing is it's interpreting it as G10 and then 0 as fill in. So it's filling in significant digits. So like if you do 2.12 string G100, you get G102. And I think that's because it's interpreting it as literal G10. So it interprets it as custom, and then it does a literal G10, and then it starts filling in the zeros with the digits.
Well, but it's printing in the middle of the string. So 1.12 string G107, 2 stringed as G117. Oh, I think I know what it's doing. Let's make it 21.1. Yes, the 0 it picks up as print it with the print the 0 fill. So 21.1 G407 prints as G4 and then 21 and then 7 because it saw it as a custom prefix of G4 and a custom suffix of 7 with the format specifier of 0. So G308 here is G3 followed by double.maxvalue.toString as if you did toString 0, followed by, there should be an 8 somewhere.
Fun.
Yes, this is why everyone's always afraid to change format parsing. All right, did we conclude new API instead of change the format parser because no one understands how it works?
I think so.
That is correct, and I actually wrote it up why I believe that's the case while you were having your fun, and then you can read
half. Did we say we're not going to add half?
Well, because you said like there's no point.
Yeah, it's 21 digits, but I just wanted to make sure.
Because you're clamping it.
Yeah.
We don't need a variant for parse because parse is infinitely precise, right?
Yeah. Parse will already consider up to the maximum number of digits plus a rounding digit, such that it works as if to infinite precision.
Sorry, say that again.
Parsing works as if to infinite precision, which in practice is it has to consider up to 769 digits, which is the longest possible format string plus a rounding digit plus the null termination character.
Is that the pair we already have? Like, is our parsing already doing that, or is our parsing?
Yeah, no, our parsing is already doing that. That was part of the 3.0 work that where I broke Bang and other things.
Everyone.
Good.
But he broke them in the right way. Yeah, so I think that this is all we need, and we're okay with it because it's for complicated debugging and not mainline scenarios.
Right. Then let's move on from this one.
Seems maybe fine.
I mean, we have done this for other
Assuming
types,
all
right?
of these overloads are already present for string.
Well, my bar would have been int, but
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what Jan does and doesn't like.
He doesn't like adding generic methods on.
I thought he didn't like
generic
adding
types?
instance methods on generic types.
yes,
If that
Yes.
type is a core type, but generic methods he's okay with because
they
they
are per instance.
they don't increase the per type object cost.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Instance methods get a new instantiation on every single generic type, so that would bloat the memory footprint. This won't get an instantiation unless you explicitly call it.
Okay, let me try to group these guys here.
Yeah, so as a bunch of statics, it shouldn't change anything.
Correct.
So there is, so basically it has generic ones and non-generic ones. So let me do that. And so we basically have parse with a char, and we have one with ignore case. Okay, that clearly doesn't apply to. This, okay.
So if this was any type other than Ross char, I would say it really needs to indicate how much data it read. I don't know how we feel about that with Ross char. Right.
It's kind of funny because the internal implementation right now literally takes the string, turns it into a Ross char, and then operates on it. So it consumes the entire string.
Okay, our parse behavior is already if there's ambiguous data at the end, it fails.
That is.
I argue we shouldn't do that because that's also not how int works. Like int32 try parse takes the read-only span of char and outs the int32. Oh, sorry, it's the
That's
result.
fair.
It's the
Fair
it's
enough.
the
I mean,
result.
yeah, fair enough. But like most things that we've added now that are reading from spans, either I guess it's if they don't indicate how much they read, it means that they're supposed to consume the whole thing. And so
Yes.
if the impression here is I consumed the whole thing, and
Yes.
not that you should be able to use this try parse as read the stuff from the beginning and then tell me what's after it, then
Right, it consumes the whole thing. I'm looking at the implementation.
okay. So if it's consumed the whole thing, then it is reporting how much was consumed to the person, which is length.
Do we
So-
have an API where we can basically parse an int and like you tell me how much you read? Is it?
UTF-8 parser does that.
Yeah, the UTF-8 formatting or the deformatter or
I
parser
see.
or whatever we called it.
So we don't
Says
have.
how many characters it read.
I see. And so I guess for Enum we don't have that because well it's a you don't parse them usually. I guess you could trivially do it, right? You would basically just look ahead and then slice the span and then call Enum, right?
Yeah, there might be some white space handling here. I'm having a little bit of difficulty following the code, but it looks like it consumes everything.
Okay. I mean, the string one already was doing something, and this is going to do the same thing as the string one, and so
Yeah.
So it's fine. I'm just keeping the general notion in people's heads of when we're, especially if we support partial reading, then we should be reporting what the partial read was.
We only support span here. That also makes sense.
Yes, and like I said, the current implementation literally takes the string, calls as span, and then passes that to the helper method. So this would just be bypassing that and calling the helper method directly.
Mm-hmm.
So
the only reason the string itself is even passed around is because it's used for in exceptional cases, because it needs the original string to throw an exception. But it's an exceptional case. I don't care if there's an allocation from read-only span of char.to string.
Yep.
do we actually constrain to enum on enum? I don't think we do, right? We only constrain to struct.
We currently don't because the existing members predate the enum constraint.
No, but I also believe we act. No, some of the generic ones are very recently added, and I think Jan pushed back on constraining it because he said most of the consuming code is very unlikely to have the constraint to enum, so you wouldn't be able to call them.
Correct. Yeah, we would want to have the same constraints that these string overloads have. We'll just match them whatever they are.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So that means you would remove the comma enum from the.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Other than that, I think it looks reasonable.
Yeah. The check is free at runtime anyway, so it doesn't really matter if we have a constraint or not.
Yeah, it's more for can you call the method to begin with? Because
Yeah.
you can't cast the freaking constraint away, right?
Yeah, I kind of wish we could, but whatever.
Yeah, that was one short-sighted decision when they originally didn't add these constraints.
I mean, I know why it was done, but whatever.
Yeah, why didn't they add the constraints?
Oh, why they weren't added in the first place?
Yeah.
Because if say that I'm inside of the JSON serializer, for instance, I am generic over T, and maybe I know that my T is a struct because I need a different implementation for struct versus class, but I myself am not constrained to enum. The only reason I even know it's an enum is because type of t.enum returned true.
If you mean why didn't the language have them, my understanding is the runtime said they weren't going to be able to deliver on the enum constraint feature before the 2.0 release, so the language team took it out of the 2.0 language.
Yeah.
Then the runtime team delivered on it, and then the language team took 10 years to add support for it. And then now we have the 10 years of delta in the middle where you're in the state that Levi mentioned.
Yeah, and we also don't have a good way within the JIT itself to represent, like, I actually do fulfill this constraint. Please let me call this method.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, yeah, I was curious why we didn't. I mean, originally I thought from Mads that they just didn't add it to the language because they didn't feel like it was super useful. And I thought that's kind of the problem, because then when you don't do it for 10 years, now you have the viral problem where you can no longer realistically add it without breaking everybody.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
it's
kind of like UTF-8 string.
Yeah. Well, because it's interesting because the runtime got it, they added support for it in the IL. Like the bit was there, and you could make the complex. You could make it where the runtime understood it. The language had some behavior in that state. You just couldn't declare new methods that had that behavior.
Right.
And so it was and then it was like, well, it's a trivial feature. Like, there's no value in adding it. And it's like, well, your exception's stupid because it says it's not supported, but it totally is. So anyway, it's there now. They just went with capital enum instead of lowercase enum.
So the previous owner of System.io thought that this was a valuable feature.
Yeah, I just saw that. I wanted to look who proposed it. So we already have FileSystemEnumerable, right?
Yes.
So I see now. Okay. No, I actually can read what this thing
I've never
says.
even seen this type before.
Well, it's fairly recent. It's we added it to speed up, I think, predominantly MS Build. It's basically a faster enumeration API with
Core 2.1 plus. All right, so they want it as a single delegate instead of a event.
I mean, events and delegates are largely the same anyway. The only difference is that an event forbids you from invoking it.
The existing features are exposed through delegates.
Are
Fair
there?
enough.
Yep.
What are the existing?
It has the predicate, which
Should
returns an
include
answer.
and should recurse predicate. They're on the issue, but I see them in the docs as well.
Yeah, but those are returning answers.
Well, I mean, basically, it's a property of type delegate, right?
Well, it's a property of a type, which is a nested type.
Yeah. So find predicate is a delegate, right? So
yeah,
basically,
but so find.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a delegate that returns an answer. Usually, because events, aside from the occasional state where they have like a cancel property on their event, events are usually like, hey, FYI, and there's nothing you can do that will make me do anything different now.
So when you say event, I think you need to be clear that there's this event keyword in C#, and then there is the notion of object sender, and then something derived from event args. And
Yes.
I think you are talking mostly about the latter, right?
Well, I'm talking about both.
Yeah, because I would argue that for this type, I agree with you that events have issues because they seem fairly heavyweight. I still am not sure why we went with properties and not the event keyword, because why would the caller ever have to invoke this guy? Realistically, the caller only ever needs to subscribe and unsubscribe. And I mean, setting a delegate is meaningless because realistically, all delegates in .NET are multicast anyway, so the argument that you could have multiple subscribers still exists. Right? Because anybody could still subscribe with plus equals. I would just argue that in this case, we already went down the pattern of, nested type for the predicate, nested type for the delegate for whatever reason, and properties, right? So I would keep doing this, but as a general argument, I would probably have said we should have probably made it an event.
Right. Well, again, I can understand the current ones because they're asking, it's letting you know, hey, given the state of whatever this file system entry is, answer the true/false question of whatever find means. And
this normally would have been a virtual method.
I'm giving you a thing, and I need you to provide me the answer. But the I'm done now, there's no answer. So it really seems much more like a broadcast notification. Therefore, it should be an event. Now, if you think it's weird that we have two settable delegate properties in one event, then sure, but it doesn't seem too weird to me.
Yeah, I would not mix it. I mean, to me, like, I think, yeah. I think we should probably have this larger discussion on events at some point, because we talked about this before, how events don't really work in our world anymore. But I think this is more to do with the fact how delegates are designed in .NET. Like, multicast doesn't make sense when you want to get answers anyway. It's like, well, I terminated the first one who gave me an answer, so tough luck.
Right. Which is why you wouldn't want an event type that includes an answer.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. Event type is in its of itself a weird terminology, right? Because they're all just delegates with some established signature, right? Like, that's all it is.
You wouldn't want to use as an event a delegate that it has a non-void return.
Why wouldn't this delegate take ref file system entry like the other two delegates do?
Well, because it's finished. There's no data anymore.
Yeah, but no, the data is the directory that it was iterated over.
Oh, if it's going to tell you what directory it was doing, then it should just give the whole entry. And presumably they're ref because
it's a large struct.
Yeah.
But it's because they clearly give you the directory information when they're asking, should I recurse into this? So file system entry clearly has a way to represent a directory.
Yeah. Is it perhaps more expensive to keep that information around? Like, maybe this is using a find file or find data, whatever it's called, struct that's being reused. It'll have to copy for each directory.
Well, I mean,
I guess you have to do that for the name anyway, so
maybe I'm not understanding it, but my understanding is that the file system entry they give you is basically a wrapper around the underlying OS struct, right? So when you're done, you're no longer standing on an invalid entry, right? So
what do you mean by that?
So the file system entry that they give you to the find transform and the find predicate, my understanding is that this is a ref struct that is literally basically a very thin wrapper around the OS entry for the file system, right?
Correct.
So when you are done enumerating, you're no longer standing on a valid entry.
Well, when your predicate returns, you can't capture the file system entry inside of a closure or anything else. There's no way to smuggle it outside of the predicate itself without involving unsafe code.
Yeah, I don't think that's the problem. It's more like they can like, what entry would they give you? And
they would give you the
same durant they gave to the should recurse.
Yeah.
Like, essentially, should recurse is your begin directory, and now they want an end directory, and you would just leave that saved as a local.
That, yes.
So it's going to consume slightly more stack. Who cares?
Okay, I guess my brain does not work this way. So so basically you're saying that So should recurse is basically the I'm about to. And
Right. So you're walking C:\users,
yep,
and it sees public, and it calls should recurse and gives you the dir int for public.
yep,
And now you know if you return true, all your entries are now inside users public. And what they want to know is before they get the next call to should recurse, because they could have popped a directory and now they're looking at files in that directory. I don't know the order that it walks things. I'm just asserting. They want to know, hey, I'm done now with users public, and I'm going like I'm popping back up to users, and then they'll get the next should recurse into users emo, and then they want the I'm done with emo, and because we all want to be done with emo, but no, we love you.
I feel the love through the through the stream.
So this is really, they already have, like, the should recurse functionally is a on enumerating directory, and they now want on enumerated directory.
Right. So it seems like basically, I'm not sure about the arrow one, but it seems like you want uniformity in terms of like you always have access to the directory. So to the file system entry you're standing on.
Right. So Levi suggested changing, instead of it taking read-only span of char directory, that it would take the same ref file system entry that you passed to the should recurse predicate.
Right.
Yeah, it gives you the entry for the directory. I don't know what continue on error predicate would take. Like, I don't know what that error code refers to.
I guess it's the underlying error, right? But like
the error came from where the error code's documented.
well, I think logically that's kind of what we would expose if we would have thrown an IO exception, right?
Well, is it a Win32 error code? What does that mean on Linux?
Yeah, it's the underlying operating system error code. It's the same if you catch an IO exception in Linux. What does the error code property give you? Pretty sure it's the underlying OS error code.
I think it's the error no.
So that would be the same behavior.
Okay.
But yeah, it's kind of fishy because we don't generally do that.
IO exception does not have an error number on it.
Exception does. No.
Exception has an H result.
Yeah, I think IO exception puts the error no in H result.
So it wraps it inside of 0x8 blah 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 blah.
Well, H result is just an int property, so I think that it just returns like 2.
Normally, H results use negative values to indicate errors. I'd be awfully suspicious if I saw a positive number for H result.
It gets used as generic passing of a number all the time.
Okay.
H result is only an H result when it's SEH exception or Win32 exception. Otherwise, it's whatever number somebody felt like putting here, or
Okay.
the default, which is the Win32 H result for CLR exception.
Sounds good.
But yeah, so it's if they already have a way of detecting it, then it's whatever that error is. So I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't think they need the word action in the property. It's just on directory finished.
Yeah, what are the other ones called?
I guess they call it should include predicate and should recurse predicate. So being redundant is matches the style of this type. So sure, it's fine. It uses past tense to indicate the action is already over. So that's correct. So yeah, just changing the read-only span char to ref file system entry, and then seems good to me.
So you would still call it action and predicate then, because that's the existing style.
It matches the existing style, as does inappropriately using nested types.
Yeah. And we are fine with the Continue on error, taking just an error code. Should it also give you the file system entry? It might not be able to, right? I guess it must be able to because you're still standing on it because you're still determining whether you go further or not.
Yeah, I don't know. It feels like it needs to give you some kind of context, but if it can't hydrate a file system entry, then what would it give you? Maybe the path of what it tried to hydrate?
Yeah, because presumably it has the what directory is it in when it got this error. But
yeah, it should at least be able to give you the file system entry for the container and then maybe the span for the child that it couldn't open, right?
Yeah, but it wouldn't. The file system entry struct itself also contains things like created date, things like that. Those properties might not be sensible.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You may not have the file system entry for the thing you couldn't access, but you should have it for the container.
Right, but because the container, presumably your on error is gonna fire if you've registered everything and should recurse said it got called, you return true because you already statted the directory, and now it calls the whatever the enumerate for that node is, and then it gets back an error, and now it's like, hey, I'm in users public and I got error access denied. What should I do? Ideally, it would tell you what thing it was trying to do, including the empty span for I was trying to like access the directory list, but
yeah,
because this would be the thing of like Explorer popping the dialog of, hey, I'm trying to copy this file now and I got an access denied. Do you want me to abort or skip this file or try again?
Yeah,
this can't express, try again.
I guess my concern would be like if the error is for a very particular file that we couldn't access, then does it make sense to give you the entry for the directory? Because the entry will contain properties about the directory, but won't contain properties about the file.
Right, but if it gave you ref directory and roshchar,
like child name or something.
Yeah, and the error code, then that's here's everything. Here are the two inputs that produce this output.
That makes sense, I think.
The current context plus the delta equals this error.
So the ref struct is the parent directory and the file name or subdirectory name or something that it couldn't access.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems sensible.
So what is the signature then of this one? Ref file system entry. Read only.
Ref file system entry directory or parent, I guess.
Yeah.
And then
comma roshchar entry. Comma int error.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the names of the two where was I parameters, but that's the best I can come up with in 6 seconds.
Instead of an int, could that be an exception? Can add more data to it later?
I assume. Yeah, I was gonna say I assume that they wrote it this way so that it's the don't throw an exception. It's the here's the error code. Please don't do the.
Well, it doesn't need
creating.
to throw, but you can pass an exception type instead of an int or some other type. Like, what is this int supposed to be? How do I interpret that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit fishy to give you an instance of an exception that wasn't actually thrown.
Because I mean, false presumably would then mean that the thing throws it, at which point it would gain the call stack. But it meant that every time you get a little error, where it went through all of this work to be reducing the amount of data allocation it does, every time it sees an error, it creates the exception to ask you, should I throw this? And so giving it from if the only thing you would do from that exception is then look at the number, then I think they're saying, what if I just give you the number?
Are these error cases frequent enough where we can't do allocations in these, even if we don't throw?
I don't know.
I mean,
presumably it's like you tried to enumerate something you didn't have access to, or
I mean, that's
like
the thing, right? If you actually enumerate large chunks of the file systems, I mean, that's when you want to use those APIs because they reduce allocations. And yeah, if you're not admin, if I enumerate the C drive, yeah, there's a fuck ton of shit I can't access.
Yeah.
Well, but largely you'll hit a directory wall and it'll tell you can't go, and then you'll move on. You wouldn't. So you'd get this, tens to hundreds of times, not thousands to millions of times.
Yeah. So I guess per Corey's argument, like if we did ever want to add additional context to this in the future, then generally what we would do is we would have a context parameter that we give you as opposed to 3 different arguments. And then we just add properties to that in the future as needed.
Yeah, I agree with that. Unfortunately, that's not the design of the type, right? We already have this delegate style where we give you individual arguments.
No, so we would give you a ref error entry, and the ref error and the error entry struct contains references back to the file system entry, the child it was trying to enumerate, and the error code. And in the future, if we want to, more properties. It becomes our context object.
Sure. So how about this?
I don't know if this is a good idea. It's just future-proof.
So it gives you back a ref file system enumerable of t result dot enumeration error, since this thing loves nested types.
Yes. Well, file system entry itself is not generic, I believe. Someone check me on that.
It is a non-generic ref struct.
Yes. So this would be the same. It would be a non-generic ref struct.
Right, but would we define it as a nested type like everything else on this has done, or would it be a sibling type?
I'd make it a sibling to file system entry.
Okay, so how about this then? We mark this as needs work.
Yeah, because the first delegate, like the problem here is they added 2 things. So we approved the first one and
with changes, we approved it.
Who owns Iono?
Carlos?
Probably.
Did it move?
Yeah, it might be Carlos and Eric T.
Yeah, and Jeremy K is still giving feedback as owner emeritus.
We call that Nosy Nelly.
Yes.
I'd also like more information on what that integer is supposed to be. Like, is it erno on Linux and a Win32 error on Windows, or how is the user supposed to use it?
That's my understanding, and it's the same as everybody who has a catch IO exception and then looks at the hresult code. Because I know that there was an attempt, like we do a little bit of mapping of erno. Like there's an erno for no memory, and we turn that into a out of memory exception. There's a erno for access denied, and we turn that into an access denied exception, while still setting whatever the data. And then every other IO error is like, I don't know, IO exception. This is an erno I don't know, so deal with it.
Yeah. So at that point, it might be nice to have a mapping of error node to an enum, and that enum would be on the context object, and it would tell you what exactly went wrong.
Maybe that's a whole lot of nicety for a thing that's probably a rare situation.
Well, this API is a nicety, right?
Well, I wouldn't call the ref struct a nicety, but okay.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, the notion where it says like, hey, you need to understand that if you're on Linux, this is an erno, and you deal with that, like that is the definition of a power feature.
What I'm trying to prevent is where in 6.0 we introduce this, and then in 7.0 we introduce a brand new property because we need to change a signature.
No, I think creating the context struct so that we don't need to change the signature of the delegate. I think that's that's basically the event pattern already, right? Is use a custom type because you can't change the delegate after the fact.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this is that totally makes sense on that one. It's we would, instead of the 3 parameters that we discussed, it would be the 1, this is everything that went wrong, and then we could make that nicer in the future. Like here's the error number, and then later we have the like here's the enum of like friendly meanings of what the number means, which is correct based on the platform you're on. But we wouldn't need to do those at the same time, is my point.
So we did 8 issues today, so that's good. We are over time now. I suggest we end it, and then next week we may even do more. All right, guys. Then enjoy your weekend. And
And
then
we'll
I
see you all on
Thank you. You did.
Tuesday,
Bye-bye.
I guess.
Sounds good.
Adios.
Bye bye.
I'm gonna hang back.